Welcome to the latest Clementary, where I aim to breathe life back into the ghosted LGBTQ torchbearers of history. Today's subject is Arabella Hunt, who was born in 1662 and is one of the great queer torchbearers of history, whose fame as an opera singer and as a musician and celebrity was diminished by the heteronormative historiography of the late 1800s, which is when all the great queer torchbearers of history were ghosted, so that unless you're a straight man, you didn't get through. Arabella is too famous to be ghosted on so many grounds. She was the muse of composers Henry Purcell and Dr. John Blow. In fact, she was very important to both their careers and reputations. They wrote operas inspired by her magnificent soprano voice, which was described as the reed of a bullfinch. She spent most of her life in the royal court of St. James's Palace as a singer and tutor to Princesses Mary, which was born in the same year as Mary actually, and Princess Anne, and is believed to have had affairs with Aphra Behn, Nell Gwyn, and numerous other women courtiers of the age. John Blow proclaimed Arabella Hunt reigns alone as the Queen of Music by the people's choice. In fact, Arabella Hunt is the first person to hold the title of Queen by people's choice, a term which we frequently use now to describe people of enormous popularity and charisma. She was a true child of the Restoration, and looking at her life really gives us a wonderful glimpse of the Restoration. She was defined by the return of King Charles II which took place 2 years before her birth in 1660, following the death of Oliver Cromwell, and subsequent revolution, which Charles reopened all the theatres and legalised fashion, singing, dancing, drinking, cross-dressing, just fun generally. Proclaimed that women could perform on stage alongside men for the first time in history. Her birth in 1662 coincided with three other sensational historic occasions. Firstly, the marriage between Charles and Queen Catherine of Braganza, who popularised tea, as those of you who've watched previous Clementaries know. Secondly, the birth of Lesbian Princess Mary, who later was Queen Mary, ruling with the Dutch invader William III of Holland, but he was in Holland most of the time, seeing to business there, or up in Ireland slaughtering Catholics. So she was in St. James's Palace most of the time alongside Arabella Hunt. But the third event took place just a few months after her birth and created perhaps the most sensational headlines. Was the mock wedding between Lady Castlemaine, Barbara Villiers, and Lady Frances Stuart, who many Britons will be familiar with because she's still on the back of a lot of 50p coins as Britannia. But this marriage took place in St. James's Palace. It was a formal marriage ceremony in which Barbara and Lady Frances were joined. After the wedding ceremony and the party, Charles and all the partygoers followed them into the bedchamber, as was tradition on the first night of a couple's marriage, and Charles was permitted to oversee the marriage consummated, and afterwards allowed to chastely sleep beside. That's according to Samuel Pepys. These three events that took place in the year of her birth and the people involved in them shaped Arabella's life both personally and as a member of the royal court. Queen Catherine of Braganza brought the much needed financial injection of cash and tea, restoring Britain's wealth and funding the cultural renaissance her LGBT royal court restored Britain as the hub of European and cultural excellence and eccentricity. For most of her life, Arabella Hunt was employed by the royal court as a singer, lutist and musical tutor to the royal princesses. In 1675, the 12-year-old Arabella gained an international reputation as an opera singer when she performed with Princesses Mary, also 12, and Princess Anne, and Princess Anne was 10, in the opera Callisto by John Crown. The opera was part of a grand mass to present Princesses Mary and Anne to the European royal marriage market, and 2 years later Mary married Dutch William of Orange. Callisto, or the chaste nymph, was based on Ovid's Metamorphosis, newly translated by the lesbian playwright Aphra Behn, who would later write a play based on Arabella Hunt's scandalous marriage to another woman. Like most theatrical, literary and operatic productions, the chaste nymph, as it was colloquially known, is dominated by LGBTQ plus themes. And many historians have speculated that this was because women weren't allowed to act on stage, but as we know, after 1660, they were. So, and yet the LGBTQ themes continued to dominate stage productions en masse. This was an age, remember, that saw Nell Gwyn rise in status from the daughter of a prostitute to an actress, to the royal mistress, lesbian courtier, all by the age of 20. So pretty phenomenal stuff. In Metamorphosis, which Callisto, the chaste nymph, is based on, Jupiter disguises himself as the goddess Diana in order to seduce Callisto. Arabella played the part of Jupiter in Crown's opera, and the 12-year-old Princess Mary played the role of Callisto. So we've got, just to be clear again, Arabella is dressed as Jupiter, disguised as Diana, who seduces Callisto, Princess Mary. So this is all pretty scandalous stuff. In Ovid, of course, Jupiter rapes Callisto, but that wouldn't have suited the Restoration audiences. Women dominated, I think, by 25% more women than men. Yes, there were 4 women to every 3 men. But so rape was not on. So in Callisto, the chaste maid, Arabella seduces Princess Mary. It's all pretty heady stuff. And talk of it, dominated 1675 when she was only 12. Practicing for the opera dominated the whole year. It was 6 months, and it took place in Whitehall and St James's Palace every single day. A full 6 months before the Great Mass, was attended by all the grandees, royals and illustrious personages of the age. Arabella may not have been presented as a marriage prospect at the event, but she certainly emerged as a superstar, a household name, and within a year was the most celebrated musician and singer of the age. But she was so much more than that. As I said, known for her great beauty, painted by Godfrey Kneller. Have a little peek on Google. But it was in 1680, so 5 years later, that so she had numerous proposals of marriage, obviously, by the time she was 18. But instead, in 1680, aged 18, she married the 18-year-old Arabella married the 18-year-old or 19-year-old Amy Poulter in the guise of James Howard. A trans man, she married him at St Marylebone Church, on the 12th of September. But the next year, the two lived as man and wife in Arabella Hunt's mother's house on the Haymarket. But by the end of the first year of marriage, Arabella sought an annulment from the conciliatory court, a court in which, matters of marriage and morality were decided, on the grounds that James was in fact a hermaphrodite, previously married Arthur Poulter, who was recently deceased. But whether Arabella really was so naive as to think that she was marrying a man was not discussed in the consistory court, but it was heavily discussed on the streets of all the towns, villages, cities of Britain, because she was courted by him both as a man and as a woman, in the guise of a woman and as a man. The tabloid press went wild for the story. James Howard claimed on his part that it was just a bit of a joke, no harm done, something, a bit of a prank. The case played out in the tabloid press, but it also was, before it came to the consistory court, after she first lodged her request, it was believed that Aphra Behn was referring to her marriage in her play The False Count, in which an elderly husband becomes suspicious of his wife and her relationship with her sister and maid. The line, "I have known as much danger hid under a petticoat as a pair of breeches. I have heard of true women that married each other. Oh, abominable, as if there was so prodigious a scarcity of Christian man's flesh," had the audience roaring in the aisles. The audiences, the population, basically didn't think it was an abomination. They thought it was hilarious. But yes, it was very topical, the whole court case, because it did sort of celebrate lesbian relationships. And also it was cocking a snook at the Puritans. But throughout the Restoration, women's sexuality was a source of fascination, with pamphlets flying off the presses of Fleet Street, describing the female clitoris as phallic, and giving it the attributes of phallus, and detailing instructions on how to bring a woman to orgasm. Within a month, the courts granted Arabella her annulment on the grounds that two women could not be legally married, legally made man and wife. So there the scandal ended. Largely perhaps because Amy Poulter is believed to have committed suicide soon after, but nothing more was said. Arabella moved back into St James's Palace, where she spent the rest of her life as a tutor or musician to Princesses Mary, Queen Mary she became, and Queen Anne. It's believed that so also when Queen Mary became queen in 1689, after Aphra Behn's fabulous book on the abolition of slavery, Oronuku, she granted Arabella £100 a year, which was on top of her earnings from public performances. Arabella's fame just continued to rise after the court case. Throughout her life, she stayed living at the Royal Palace as the muse of composers Henry Purcell and John Blow. She was always in demand. She could accompany herself beautifully on the lute, and was just hugely popular at the King's Theatre in Covent Garden, and poets throughout the kingdom dedicated poetry and odes to her. I highly recommend we return to this for International Women's Day on Monday, the 8th of March, because, of course, this year we're specifically celebrating non-heterosexual women, women living different lives, women who dare. And so I think that it would be nice to write odes to specific women we want to celebrate. I intend to write odes. I may even write another ode to Arabella Hunt, although William Congreve probably wrote the best ode to her, an irregular ode to Mrs. Arabella Hunt, singer, which I highly recommend. But she died peacefully in the palace in 1705 in the reign of the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, of course, as we know. Another great lesbian. Because a lot of women were choosing